On a warm Saturday afternoon, November 27, 2024, in the bustling downtown area, where the streets are filled with cafes and fashion boutiques, a situation unfolded that no one had anticipated. In a parking lot near the popular restaurants and bars, the shiny car of a young couple, Karen and Brad, was approached by a group of police officers. The couple, enjoying a quiet afternoon in their luxury vehicle, had no idea that their peaceful moment would quickly spiral into an unexpected and troublesome situation. On this sunny afternoon, with the golden rays of the sun creating a warm and comfortable atmosphere, Brad sat in the car, scrolling through his phone, oblivious to his surroundings. Meanwhile, Karen, ever the one to focus on her appearance, was playfully fixing her hair in the rearview mirror. The air was light, calm, and everything seemed serene. But that peace was shattered when a police officer appeared outside their car. "Hello, folks," the officer spoke in a polite yet firm tone. "We need the keys, there's a gun visible in your vehicle." The officer's words were professional, but they seemed to startle Karen slightly. However, instead of reacting with fear or confusion, she chose to maintain her confident exterior, as if nothing unusual was happening. She shook her head, shrugged her shoulders, and threw a disdainful glance at the officer, as if dealing with such a trivial inconvenience. "What's going on?" Karen flicked her hair dramatically. "What do you mean?" "We're just sitting here, officer." Her response was challenging, as if she was utterly unaware of any potential problem, but it only made the situation more tense. The officer, clearly accustomed to such reactions, remained unfazed and explained that their car might be in violation of laws regarding the improper storage of a weapon. In a tense atmosphere, the officer, with admirable composure and professionalism, explained the serious situation Brad and Karen were facing. Speaking slowly and clearly, with no emotion in his voice, the officer stated, "This is unlawful use of a weapon," and continued, "We need to retrieve the gun from the vehicle to ensure it's stored properly." Despite the gravity of the situation, the officer remained calm, as if this were just another routine task. Brad, who was not accustomed to taking direction from others, reacted predictably. Leaning back in his seat, with a smug expression, he paid little attention to the officer's explanation. "I don't see why we need to make a big deal out of this," Brad muttered, his voice tinged with impatience. "I'm not a criminal." His words radiated overconfidence, as though his lack of a criminal record meant that breaking the law was not something to be concerned about. This refusal to take responsibility not only showcased Brad's arrogance, but also reflected his lack of understanding of the serious consequences that improper firearm storage could bring. This paragraph highlights the contrast between the officer's professionalism and patience and Brad's stubbornness and lack of cooperation. The police weren't just performing a task to uphold the law. They were trying to ensure the safety of both the couple and the community, while Brad dismissed the law, viewing improper firearm handling as something inconsequential. The tension in this scene was a clear indication of an inevitable confrontation between two opposing forces, one upholding the law, and the other defying it. However, the officers had no intention of backing down. They persisted in demanding access to the car, even as the couple continued to argue. One of the officers calmly stated, "We're trying to work with you, but if you don't hand over the keys, we'll have to tow the car." This warning only added to the tension. Brad, determined to save face in front of his partner, began to act more rigidly. His eyes widened with stress as he tried to appear unshakable. But this only further complicated matters, as Karen, though visibly flustered, refused to back down. "Towing? You think you can tow my car?" she snapped, her voice laced with fury. She gripped her phone as if it were her lifeline, a way to feel in control of the situation, even though everything around her was spiraling out of her control. Every move Karen made clearly demonstrated her determination not to let anyone, including the police, interfere with her life. As the standoff dragged on, the air became thick with tension, like a summer storm just before it bursts. The frustration and impatience grew, with every second feeling longer than the last. Karen held her ground, clutching the keys tightly in her hand, her eyes locked on the officers with a mix of defiance and disbelief. "You're not taking my keys," she snapped, as if the mere suggestion was an insult to her personal freedom. Brad, equally obstinate, felt the pressure building around him. His face reddened with frustration as he began pacing in small circles, clearly agitated. He muttered under his breath, his hands running through his hair, before stopping abruptly to bark at the officer, his voice rising with irritation. "We don't have to deal with this, we'll just leave." It was as if he believed that his defiance could simply make the situation disappear. But the officer, maintaining his composure, responded firmly, "If you don't let us handle this properly, we'll tow your car." The simplicity of this threat seemed to trigger something in Karen. Her frustration escalated into full-blown indignation as she pulled out her phone again, frantically tapping away at the screen. "I'm making important calls," she shouted at the officers, as if her incessant phone calls could magically make the situation vanish. She was glued to her screen, her fingers moving rapidly, her voice rising to absurd levels, desperately trying to regain control, even if it meant ignoring the unfolding reality before her eyes. What had started as a minor misunderstanding about a weapon in plain view had now escalated into a full-blown battle of wills. Karen's refusal to cooperate and Brad's simmering frustration turned what could have been a simple resolution into a farcical confrontation. Brad, realizing the situation was escalating and seeing that the officers weren't backing down, quickly adopted the strategy of playing the innocent citizen card to justify his actions. He sighed dramatically, his eyes filled with dissatisfaction, shaking his head as if he were the victim of some unfair situation. "You can't do this." Brad raised his voice, speaking with exaggerated drama. "I only have this gun for protection." He tried to paint himself as a mere defender, as if he were the victim of a huge misunderstanding, but the officer remained unfazed by his justification. With a slight sigh, the officer seemed tired of Brad's ignorance. "Not like this, especially a public place, and certainly not in a bar area where alcohol is involved. This is not just a bad decision. It's illegal." The officer's voice was firm, pointing out an undeniable fact without any mercy. Brad opened his mouth to argue, but the officer cut him off. "This is not how you carry a firearm, buddy." His words hit Brad like a bucket of cold water, leaving him speechless. In that moment, Brad realized that his words couldn't change the reality of how he had handled the gun and that continuing to argue would only make things worse. The tension heightened as the couple, now fully in fight mode, began to yell at the officers. Karen, completely oblivious to the severity of the situation, yelled back in frustration, "Don't talk to us like that." She seemed unaware that everything she did was only escalating the situation. Meanwhile, the officers, though visibly frustrated, kept their composure and tried to calmly explain the issue, not wanting things to escalate further. One of them, with a patient expression, said, "Look, we just want to help you understand the proper way to store and carry a weapon. No need to make this a big scene." The calmness and polite demeanor of the officers showed they were trying their best to resolve the situation without adding to the tension. However, the couple, especially Karen, had no interest in listening or understanding. Despite the officers merely doing their jobs explaining the laws about carrying and storing weapons legally, Karen felt they were lecturing her and treating her disrespectfully. Her ignorance and defensive attitude were the primary factors fueling the tension, making everything more difficult to resolve. This moment was a classic example of the disconnect between people who refuse to accept the explanations of law enforcement and officers who only want to maintain order and protect the community. From the officers' calm efforts to the couple's aggressive resistance, the situation highlighted a significant difference in how tense situations are perceived and handled between the public and law enforcement. Drama, it seemed, was the other name for this couple. As the officers began to retrieve the weapon from the vehicle, Karen, in a moment that could either be seen as a spark of brilliance or perhaps a reckless impulse, decided to rush past them without hesitation, heading straight for the car. Her action was not only unexpected but utterly thoughtless, given that the car was the focal point of the investigation. While the officers were still trying to handle the situation rationally and calmly, Karen, with an incomprehensible determination, charged toward the vehicle as though everything were under her control. Immediately, one of the officers, with the swift reflex of someone used to handling tense situations, grabbed Karen's arm. "You can't go in there," he said firmly, locking eyes with her in a tone that left no room for negotiation. His words were not just a warning, they were a clear reminder that she had crossed a line. But Karen seemed completely indifferent to the warning. The situation unfolded in a way no one could have anticipated. It was the first arrest in a chain of unforgettable events that day. The scene was a perfect mix of absurdity and tension. On one side, the firm resolve of law enforcement. On the other, the thoughtless actions of Karen, who seemed entirely unaware of the severity of the situation. This not only escalated the conflict, but also raised the question, did she truly understand what she was doing? The officer's intervention may have been necessary, but it felt like something straight out of a drama, where the protagonist is completely unaware of the consequences of their actions. And then, in that moment, everything became clear. Karen was not just facing an officer's obstruction. She had officially entered the next stage of this unresolvable situation. That was her arrest, much to the surprise and bewilderment of everyone around her. That simple moment, filled with questions about actions, responsibility, and consequences, became a pivotal point in the unfolding events of the day. The situation continued to escalate as the couple's resistance grew. Brad, his face flushed with anger, began shouting, as though he were the victim of some unsolvable conspiracy. "This is a trap," he yelled, his voice full of suspicion and outrage. "You're just looking for a reason to arrest us." His words reflected not just his anxiety, but a sense of being unfairly treated, as if everything had been set up against him from the start. Meanwhile, Karen, now handcuffed, refused to give in. She screamed, trying to call for help as if she could change the outcome. "My grandma is on her way. She fixed this." For Karen, this cry for help seemed like her last attempt to regain control over a situation that had spiraled out of her hands. But in reality, her grandmother had no idea about the events unfolding. She was likely enjoying a peaceful morning at home, completely unaware that her granddaughter was being arrested for obstructing justice. Of course, Karen's grandmother wouldn't be able to fix anything, and the reality was that her granddaughter would have to face the consequences of her actions. While the couple continued to resist, Karen's desperate cry seemed like a futile attempt to change what was inevitable. And even if her grandmother had shown up, there would be no magic to reverse the situation. As things began to calm down and the tension eased, the officers once again tried to explain and persuade the couple. One of the officers, with a calm yet determined expression, began to explain, "Our goal was never to escalate things or create more trouble for you," he said patiently. "We just wanted you to understand how to handle firearms safely and legally. But now, we have to deal with the consequences of your actions." The officer continued, his gaze sweeping over the couple, still looking uncomfortable, but now with a hint of hesitation in their eyes. "We didn't want things to go this far, but when a gun is left in plain view, in a vehicle parked in a public place like this, especially near high-risk areas like a bar, we have no choice but to intervene." His tone softened slightly, but each word carried seriousness. "The issue isn't that you own a gun," he continued. "What we want to emphasize is how you store it. Leaving a firearm in plain sight, especially when it can pose a danger to others, is not only irresponsible, but illegal and could lead to serious consequences." He locked eyes with Brad and Karen, making sure they understood that, regardless of their objections, the law had to be upheld. The couple had now calmed down somewhat, but they still couldn't fully grasp everything that had transpired. The police officer concluded, his voice maintaining a calm tone, but filled with disappointment, "We tried our best to prevent this situation from escalating further. But your actions today will have unavoidable consequences. We just want you to understand the importance of properly storing and handling firearms, not only to protect yourselves, but also to avoid putting others in danger." Those words were like a light slap to the couple's lack of awareness, a reminder that impulsive actions, even when there's no ill intent, can lead to unforeseen consequences. Finally, after a long period of tension and escalating conflict, the officers managed to resolve the situation smoothly. One of the officers explained in a calm yet stern voice, "This all started as a routine check, but your refusal to cooperate and the rising tension led to charges. Now, our goal is simply to ensure everyone understands how to safely store their weapons." Despite the couple's continued resistance, the officers remained patient and composed, attempting to defuse the situation. As a result, Brad was fined for unlawful use of a weapon, as he had left his gun visible in his car without proper storage. Karen, who refused to leave when asked and even attempted to interfere with the investigation, was arrested and faced charges of obstructing justice. They left the scene, not as victors, but as individuals who realized that no matter how privileged they might feel, arrogance and ignorance can bring unexpected consequences. Karma, with its ironic and unpredictable ways, had caught up with them just when they thought they could escape without facing responsibility. While they could go on with their lives, the lesson they learned that day couldn't be forgotten. Sometimes, thoughtless actions not only harm oneself, but also lead to unavoidable consequences. Karma, indeed, has a unique way of appearing, and often, it shows up when you least expect it. When it was all over, Karen and Brad were left with a bitter reflection on what had happened. They walked away in silence, no longer with the confidence or arrogance they once had. The greatest lesson they took away was one about humility and respect for the rules that apply to everyone. No matter how much power or wealth you have, no one can escape the consequences of irresponsibility and failure to cooperate. Karma always arrives unexpectedly, and sometimes, what we need most isn't power or self-satisfaction, but understanding, patience, and the willingness to listen. This story also serves as a reminder for all of us to follow safety regulations, especially when it comes to firearms. Protecting oneself is important, but protecting the community is even more crucial. None of us should ever risk others' safety because of an impulsive decision or ignorance. When we learn to respect and follow established guidelines, we not only protect ourselves, but also contribute to building a safer and more civilized society.